Hello everyone and welcome back to the 1972 World Chess Championship match between Robert James Fischer and Boris Spassky. It's game 17 and Fischer is still 3 points in the lead. Spassky, however, again has the white pieces, and it's very interesting how he will continue this match. Now games on the board are very intense, but if you've been following the series so far, you know that there is an entire match going on behind the boards. During game 15 and 16, the entire hall has been surrounded with police officers, so the viewers even said that the playing hall actually looks a lot more impressive now with all of these Icelandic police officers there. The Russian committee disassembled Fischer's chair, and they didn't find anything. But even though it was a fiasco, it did give the reporters something to write about. And although the experts and the audience and people who were kind of more into chess than your regular viewer were enjoying this chess very much, as it really was a chess spectacle, it was not all that easy to keep the viewers reading about this match all around the world with the moves only. So the chess reporters really loved everything Fischer did, even though it annoyed everyone in Spassky's camp. But yeah, that being said, let's check out this game, as it again features an opening that Fischer never before played in his entire life. So, without further ado, Spassky plays e4, and we have d6. So, Fischer goes for the Pirc defense, d4, and now g6. Sorry about that. It seems I have blundered the sound in the previous video, as so many of you have said. Knight to f6 is also possible here, but Fischer prefers this g6 idea, as it leaves black a lot more options how to develop. Knight to c3. Spassky decides to first play knight to c3 instead of knight to f3 and leave this option of playing f4 if needed. Knight to f6, Fischer transposes into the main line, and now comes f4. Bishop to g7, and now comes knight to f3, again in the main line, and this is now the Austrian attack. Well, f4 was the start of the Austrian attack. This is simply continuing with the theory. c5. This was a less known move at the time, and Fischer did it, so perhaps Spassky would not be so at home with this variation. And although e5 seems somewhat interesting here, not really. e5 seems like an attacking move, but all you've done is given black a target. After knight d7, this pawn is now attacked 3 times, and you do have to do something about it, but you haven't really achieved anything. e6 doesn't really do anything. If knight g5 going after the pawn, simply knight back to f6, the pawn is defended. All is well for black. White is down a pawn, so nothing really to show for. After this, if d captures on c5, you can regain a pawn, but then black will simply capture and ignore you. After c5, d captures on c5 by Spassky, we have queen to a5 now. If you play d captures on c5 immediately, then queen captures, king captures, and e5 will be a really amazing position for white. After knight moves, knight g5 is coming, going after f7, and after you defend this, for example, knight to h6, then bishop to e3 is coming, and you have an excellent position here for white, where all of the pieces are simply developing on itself. The position basically plays itself. So after d captures on c5, Fischer first goes queen to a5, going after the c5 pawn, and here bishop to d3. Spassky doesn't mind giving back the pawn. Queen captures on c5, now preventing Spassky from castling, and now comes queen to e2, guarding the e3 square and preparing bishop to e3. Fischer castles, we have bishop to e3, and now comes queen to a5. Guchfeld at one game played queen to c7 instead of queen to a5 here, and it seems to be also a very nice idea, but Spassky's idea is also great. We have castles, and now comes bishop to g4, pinning the knight, and this was considered to be the best idea for black. Rook a to d1, Spassky develops the rook, and now comes knight to c6. And here, bishop to c4. Here, all of a sudden, Spassky now places this bishop on this very strong diagonal and transposes into a very attacking formation. Fischer goes knight to h5. It's an excellent move because it immediately asks, what are you doing with this knight? And although it seems a bit weird to give up your strong dark square bishop, your dragon, for this knight and even a pawn, but it seems to work in this position. And here Spassky plays a very nice attacking move, bishop to b3. To understand why bishop to b3 is an excellent attacking move, we first have to see what happens if rook to d5 is played. This comes with an attack on the queen, and also after the queen moves. Perhaps this queen to c7, when we mentioned that Gufeld played this against Stahl, was better because it doesn't allow any ideas such as this. But okay, now comes rook to g5, attacking the bishop, but this doesn't work because of bishop captures on f3. Rook captures on f3, and now knight to d4 with an attack against the queen and the rook. After bishop captures with check, as you don't want to be down the exchange. King to h1, now black has knight to f4. This was Fischer's idea, because now you see the bishop on c4 is guarded by the queen, but there is another problem. Rook captures on f4, and now bishop captures on c3. B captures on c3, and now comes d5. Your rook is under attack, and also now there is a double attack against the bishop on c4. So e5, you have to protect the rook, most likely, and then d captures on c4. Black wins back the piece, he's up a pawn, and he has a better position as white's pawn structure is severely compromised. So that's why bishop to b3, simply getting the bishop away from c4, so Fischer doesn't have this d5 discovery in the future. We have bishop captures on c3. Fischer doesn't wait for Spassky to go for this rook to d5 idea now, as now this is definitely a possibility. But by playing this, Spassky also gives up a pawn. Fischer accepts it. Bishop captures, pawn captures, and now queen captures on c3. And here we have f5. By white, f5. Knight back to f6. Fischer now did everything there needed to be done with this knight on h5, and now he wants to regain control of the central squares. h3. To unpin against this knight, you do have to force black to either capture or, well, now he has to capture. Bishop to h5 is obviously not happening. Bishop captures, queen captures, and now comes knight to a5. Fischer now finds a very clever idea. He wants to get rid of this very strong light square bishop Spassky has on b3, whereas this knight to e5 move, coming with an attack against the queen, isn't all that impressive, because here queen to f4, and white would get a very strong attack if the queen manages to find her way to h6. So after queen to f3, we have knight to a5. And now comes rook to d3, attacking Fischer's queen, queen back to c7, and now comes bishop to h6. Here Spassky decided, at least I'm gonna try and be materialistic here, as I've pretty much run out of any other options. Knight captures on b3, Fischer grabs the very strong light square bishop, and here you don't have the option of capturing on f8 really, because Fischer will simply move the knight and attack your rook. So now you can't really give up this very strong bishop. It controls all of the dark squares here. You would have to move the bishop. And now after knight captures, pawn captures, the material now will be equal, pieces wise. Black will still be up a pawn, but black will be in a better position here. So after knight to b3, we have c captures on b3 by Spassky, and now comes queen to c5 with check. Here, Spassky played king to h1 automatically, but Gligorich says that instead of this king to h1 move, rook to e3 was a better defensive resource because it saves a tempo in the future. But it doesn't appear to be so, because here, after Spassky's king to h1, Fischer played queen to e5. He decided to give up the exchange here. And okay, Spassky accepted this. He played bishop captures on f8. We have rook captures on f8, and now because the knight and queen are attacking the e4 pawn, you do have to protect it. So now Spassky played rook to e3. But this is the reason why Gligorich says that this king to h1 was a waste of a tempo, that rook to e3 was better straight away. But the problem is, after rook to e3 in this position straight away, who knows if Fischer would have gone for the same exchange sacrifice with queen to e5. Perhaps he would simply move the rook, rook f to c8, and now the game continues. White does have a very strong attack, but after g4, there's no immediate anything that white has. Black should be able to fend off this attack. But okay, I'm sure Gligoric definitely had something there. King to h1, we have queen to e5. As we've said, Fischer offers a rook. Bishop captures, rook captures, and now comes rook to e3, defending the e4 pawn, as we've mentioned. Rook to c8, and this is Fischer's compensation. He has a knight against the rook, but this rook is not a very impressive rook. He's stuck guarding the e4 pawn, and the knight is a very impressive piece. On the other hand, Fischer has the sole control of the only open file, the c file on the board, and as you can see, this e4 pawn, as we've already said, and if this rook manages to infiltrate Spassky's second rank, this pawn will become weak as well. So down the exchange, but definitely has compensation. F captures on g6 by Spassky. We have h captures on g6, and now queen to f4. Spassky is ready to either infiltrate with queen to h6 or offer a queen trade, and here Spassky is hoping that he will somehow be able to activate the rooks, but Fischer says that you will not. Queen captures, we have rook captures on f4, and now comes as Spassky is threatening e5. This would be very dangerous, and it would create more open files for the rook, so Fischer stops it. Knight d7, getting the knight to e5. Rook to f2, and now comes knight to e5. King to h2, we have rook to c1, a very nice idea. Now Fischer will be able to use the last rank to attack Spassky's weaknesses here, even though this prevented the infiltration via the second rank. Rook e to e2, here Spassky is hoping for rook to c2 to either exchange a pair of rooks, but if not that, then he will at least be able to infiltrate Fischer's position via the open c file. So knight to c6, Fischer closes off the c file, and now he doesn't really care what Spassky does along the c file. Rook to c2, and now simply rook to e1. Fischer declines the trade of rooks, as if he traded rooks, then you would have a rook against a knight. Of course, white would be much better here, most likely even winning, but Fischer wants to use this rook he has to keep attacking Spassky's weaknesses by going back and forth. Rook f to e2, we have rook to a1, and now king to g3. King to g7, rook c to d2, rook to f1, rook blocks rook. We have rook to e1, and now rook to e2. Rook to f1, and here rook to e3. Spassky doesn't want to repeat the position 3 times and allow a draw by threefold repetition. And Fischer goes a6. We have rook to c3, and now rook to e1. We have rook to c4. And here, by this point, Spassky's position has improved. His rooks are much more active, but still there's not all that much he can do. You can't go knight e5 to force the rook off of the 4th rank to capture a pawn, because you would simply allow white rook to activate. That's not something you want to do. So rook to f1, Fischer simply keeps going back and forth. Rook d to c2, and now rook to a1. We have rook to f2. And here, this is move 40. Here, the game was adjourned. Spassky had to seal his 41st move, and it's very interesting. The next day, when they arrived at the board, rook to e1. Here after rook to e1, the game was adjourned, and now Spassky had to seal the move, and he sealed rook f to c2. And it was very interesting because now even Spassky's team, they complained to the chief arbiter Lothar Schmidt and said that for the next game Fischer has to be there on time, because Fischer was never on time. Well, very rarely he was on time for the game, but he was almost never on time for the continuation of the adjourned games. So Schmidt said that Fischer has to come, and this was the first game that Fischer was actually on time for the adjourned game, and he was greeted with applause for that. So Fischer played g5. This is the move he prepared overnight, and it seems like an odd move. Why would you do this? Well, it is explained. The explanation is twofold. at some point white might actually get the idea to play rook captures on c6, because Spassky can always draw this game, and Fischer can never win this game. Only Spassky can push this for the win. So if Spassky really wants to play for the win, at some point he might consider playing rook captures, win back the knight and grab a pawn by doing so, and also then he will perhaps be able to snatch off the pawns on the queen side, but it will still be very hard, because also white has weak pawns. But by doing this g5 move, he's actually grabbing a lot more space on the king side, restricting the movements of the white king, and perhaps in the future e6 and f5 will be very strong already, creating a very strong pawn presence on the king side. And also, if white doesn't go for this, then it simply frees the g6 square for black's knight if it might become needed in the future. So, very nice. Here we have rook to c1 by Spassky, offering a rook trade. We have rook to e2, and now comes again rook 1 to c2. Rook to e1, we have rook to c1, rook to e2, and again rook 1 to c2. And Fischer here called chief arbiter Lothar Schmidt, and he told him Spassky with his rook 1 to c2 repeated the position 3 times, and here Fischer claimed a draw by threefold repetition. So it's very unclear. It wasn't known at the time. I don't know if it is known now why Spassky did this. He could have pushed for the win. There were a lot of things he could have tried, and it's probably he wouldn't just agree to a draw here, because he can never lose this game, and he's already down 3 points in the match. So perhaps what happened to him was the same thing that happened to Tigran Petrosian when he was playing against Bobby Fischer. One game he drew by threefold repetition on accident. He accidentally repeated the position 3 times. So while this is what could have happened, also another explanation is that Spassky simply spent an entire night with his team, and then they couldn't figure out how to win this position with white, because there is no win, but well, it's hard to say. But yeah, that's the game. The score is now 10-7, and some of you were asking in the comments how many games are there in this match. I never announced this because for those of you who don't know how many games there are in this match, I thought it would be perhaps more interesting not to know. But if you're really interested, some may not want to know. Of course, you can always Google it. It's not really a secret, but there aren't a lot more. We will very soon we'll be over with this series. So yeah, that's game 17. I do hope you enjoyed it, as it's the first time Fischer played the Pirc defense. It was the first time, well, maybe he played it like once during simultaneous exhibitions, but not in serious tournament play. And it was the first time Fischer was on time for the continuation of the adjourned game. And again, a very attacking games by Spassky, but you know, it just wasn't meant to be. So yeah, 10-7. I would also like to thank Kenneth McKay of Scotland. Thank you for your contribution to my channel. Really, I appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you soon, hopefully with some more interesting content. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.